In a small American town, Dr. Evan Cole, a successful black surgeon, becomes the target of relentless harassment by Officer Daniels, a racist cop determined to discredit him. What begins as baseless accusations about Evan's ties to a youth center spirals into a campaign of intimidation and public humiliation, fueled by systemic racism. Evan is forced to confront not only Daniels' abuse of power, but the town's deeply ingrained prejudice, which threatens everything he's worked to build. This explosive story exposes the infuriating realities of racism in America and the devastating impact of unchecked authority and bias. The hum of tires on the rain-slicked road filled Officer Jordan Carter's patrol car as he glanced at the dashboard clock. Nearly midnight. The streets of Fairhaven were quiet, save for the occasional flicker of neon signs from the diner on Main Street or the dim glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel, a habit that matched the rhythm of his restless thoughts. Fairhaven was supposed to be a safe place, or so Jordan had always believed. But tonight was different. A string of burglaries had unsettled the tight-knit community, and every patrol brought new whispers of unease. Rounding the corner onto Willow Lane, he caught sight of a figure moving in the shadows near the corner store. A flicker of movement, gone as quickly as it appeared. His instincts sharpened, adrenaline kicking in. Jordan eased the car to a stop and stepped out, boots splashing in shallow puddles. The night was eerily silent, save for the soft patter of rain. He scanned the area, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. There, near the side door of the store, a woman stood. She was bundled in a heavy coat, her hair damp from the drizzle, her hands clutching a bag. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jordan called, his voice steady but firm. "Everything okay here?" The woman turned slowly, her eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear, more like annoyance. "I'm just waiting for my ride," she said, her voice calm but clipped. Jordan took a step closer, his flashlight illuminating the cracked pavement between them. Something about her posture made him hesitate. She didn't look like the thieves he had imagined, nervous and fidgety, but years of experience told him not to ignore his gut. "Mind telling me why you're standing here this late at night?" he pressed, keeping his tone neutral. The woman raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "It's not illegal to wait for a ride, is it, officer?" Her calm challenge unsettled him. Jordan felt the familiar stir of tension in his chest, the kind he always felt when he couldn't immediately place someone into the boxes his training had ingrained in him. She didn't fit the pattern, and yet here he was, questioning her. Why the first light of dawn spilled over the skyline of Millbrook, its rays cutting through a thin mist that lingered on the quiet streets. The town, a blend of historic charm and modern edges, seemed almost idyllic at this hour, its cobblestone sidewalks glistening with dew. For Dr. Evan Cole, this was his favorite time of day, a brief window when the world was still, and the weight of expectation hadn't yet descended. Evan sat at the small wooden table in his kitchen, stirring a cup of black coffee. The room was simple and unassuming, its decor a far cry from the lavish homes typically associated with a man of his stature. A single photograph hung on the wall, a candid shot of him and his late mother, their smiles wide and carefree. The house, like the man who lived in it, was a testament to modesty despite success. At 42, Evan Cole was one of the nation's leading heart surgeons, known not only for his unmatched skill in the operating room, but also for his relentless dedication to providing care for underserved communities. Patients traveled from across the country to seek his expertise, yet here he was, dressed in a plain gray sweater and jeans, sipping coffee in a modest home in a town that wasn't quite sure how to embrace him. Millbrook had been his mother's dream, a small town she'd often spoken of as a place where neighbors knew each other, where life was slower, and community mattered. Evan had moved back after her passing, determined to fulfill her wish of giving back to the place she'd loved. But as much as he wanted to feel at home, there were moments when the town reminded him that he was still an outsider, in more ways than one. The streets were beginning to stir as Evan pulled his SUV into the lot of Millbrook's only diner, the Silver Spoon. Its worn neon sign buzzed faintly, promising homestyle cooking and friendly service. Evan liked it here. The food was simple but satisfying, and the waitstaff treated him like any other patron, not as the man whose name had once graced the cover of Medical Times. Inside, The diner was a patchwork of checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and faded photographs of the town's history. Evan slid into his usual corner booth, nodding at Clara, the waitress who always seemed to work the morning shift. "Morning, Dr. Cole," Clara greeted warmly, balancing a pot of coffee in one hand. She was in her late 50s, with silver streaks in her auburn hair and a smile that could disarm even the most cynical customer. "Morning, Clara. How's your granddaughter doing?" Evan asked, his voice warm and genuine. Clara beamed. "Oh, she's a handful, but she just aced her math test. You know, she's talking about being a doctor one day. I keep telling her she needs to meet you for inspiration." Evan chuckled softly. "Anytime, I'd be happy to chat with her." Clara poured his coffee and left him to peruse the menu he already knew by heart. Outside the window, the town was waking up. Shop owners unlocking doors, delivery trucks rumbling past. Millbrook had a charm, no doubt about it. But beneath its postcard-perfect facade was a tension that simmered just below the surface. As Evan sipped his coffee, the diner's door jingled, announcing the arrival of a man who immediately drew the room's attention. Officer Grayson Daniels, the town's lead deputy, exuded authority in his crisp uniform. His presence seemed to fill the small diner, his posture rigid, his gaze scanning the room as if searching for something, or someone. Evan watched him for a moment, noting the faint tightening of Clara's smile as she greeted Daniels. The officer nodded curtly before moving to the counter, but not before his eyes briefly met Evan's. There was no smile, no acknowledgement, just a fleeting look that carried more weight than any words might. It wasn't the first time their paths had crossed, and each encounter carried the same undercurrent of unease. Daniels had a way of looking at Evan, not with admiration for his achievements, but with a guarded skepticism, as if he were trying to find the cracks in a facade that didn't exist. "Strange how quiet it's been this morning," Daniels remarked loudly to Clara as she poured his coffee. His voice was casual, but his tone carried a weight that suggested it wasn't just an observation. Clara responded with a polite hum, clearly unwilling to engage further. Evan, however, kept his attention on the window, pretending not to notice. But Daniels wasn't one to let things lie. "Dr. Cole," he called, his voice cutting through the diner's ambient hum. Evan turned slowly, meeting the officer's gaze. "Good morning, Officer Daniels," he replied, his tone steady but neutral. "You've been in town for what, 2 years now?" Daniels asked, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Just about," Evan said, keeping his expression calm. "Still getting used to it. I imagine small-town life isn't for everyone," Daniels remarked, his words carrying a subtle edge. Evan offered a faint smile. "It has its challenges, but I like to think I've settled in." Daniels nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Well, we're a tight-knit community. Folks here like to know who they're dealing with." Evan held his gaze, refusing to rise to the bait. "That's fair. I've always believed trust is built over time." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The tension between the two men was palpable, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. Clara, sensing the shift, quickly placed a plate of pancakes in front of Evan, her smile a little too bright. "Enjoy, Dr. Cole," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a lifeline. Evan nodded his thanks and turned his attention back to his meal, letting the conversation dissolve into the diner's ambient noise. But even as he ate, he could feel Daniels's gaze lingering, a weight that pressed down on him like an unseen force. Outside, the morning had fully unfolded. The mist had burned away, replaced by a crisp blue sky. Evan left the diner, the tension of his encounter with Daniels still clinging to him like a second skin. As he walked to his car, he caught sight of a small crowd gathered near the town square. Curious, he wandered over, blending into the group. At the center of the commotion was a podium, hastily set up, with a man in a dark suit speaking animatedly. "That's what this town needs, real leadership," the man declared, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "Not outside influences trying to tell us how to live or what to value." Evan's stomach tightened as he realized the man was Marshall Green, a local businessman with a reputation for stirring division. Green's rhetoric was subtle but insidious, always laced with the kind of language that left just enough room for plausible deniability. Evan stood silently, his presence drawing a few curious glances. He was used to it by now, the way people in Millbrook looked at him, not with outright hostility, but with a wariness that spoke of unspoken assumptions. As Green's speech continued, Evan felt a familiar mix of frustration and resolve. He hadn't chosen Millbrook to make waves, but he also hadn't come to stand idly by. He had a voice, a platform, and a responsibility to use them, not just for himself, but for the community his mother had loved. Turning away from the square, Evan made his way back to his car. The day had barely begun, but already the weight of it pressed heavily on his shoulders. There was work to be done, both in the hospital and in the town, that still didn't quite know what to make of him. Evan Cole didn't make it to the hospital that morning. As he drove out of the diner parking lot, his phone buzzed on the console. Glancing at the screen, he saw the name Carolyn Marks. She was the manager of a local youth center Evan had been funding quietly since his arrival in Millbrook. The center provided after-school programs and a safe haven for kids in the community, an initiative close to his heart. "Good morning, Carolyn," he greeted as he put the call on speaker. "Dr. Cole, I'm sorry to bother you." Carolyn's voice wavered, tension clear in her tone. "We've got a situation here at the center. Officer Daniels and another cop showed up asking questions about you. I tried to tell them you're a major donor, but they seemed persistent. They're asking about your visits here. Is everything okay?" Evan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "They're there now." "Yes, I didn't want to call, but it's making the staff nervous. Don't worry, I'm on my way." When Evan arrived at the youth center, he spotted Daniel's patrol car parked crookedly in front, its blue and white paint a jarring contrast to the cheerful mural on the building's exterior. Children's laughter could be heard faintly from the gym, but the tension was palpable as Evan stepped inside. In the main hallway, Daniels and another officer, a wiry man with an air of smug authority, stood near the front desk. Carolyn was there, her body language a mix of discomfort and quiet defiance. "Officer Daniels," Evan said as he approached, his voice steady. Daniels turned, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Cole, didn't expect to see you here this morning." "Well, when I hear that officers are asking about me, I make it a point to show up," Evan replied evenly, his gaze shifting briefly to Carolyn in silent reassurance. "What seems to be the concern?" The second officer, whose name tag read Wilkes, smirked. "Just following up on some reports, Dr. Cole, routine stuff." "Reports?" Evan asked, his tone calm but firm. "About me?" Daniels crossed his arms, stepping forward. "Let's not make this more than it is. We've had complaints about some of the businesses you frequent, loitering, unusual activity. It's our job to investigate." Evan's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Loitering," he repeated, the word hanging in the air. "And this investigation brought you to a youth center that I help fund?" "Just covering all bases," Daniel said, his voice flat. The implication was clear. Evan wasn't just a person of interest, he was a suspect in whatever narrative Daniels was spinning. Carolyn cleared her throat, stepping forward. "Dr. Cole has been nothing but generous to this center. He comes here to mentor and support the kids. There's no reason to question his involvement." Daniel shot her a glance, his expression hardening. "We're not here to accuse anyone, just doing our due diligence." Evan's patience was wearing thin, but he knew better than to escalate the situation. "If there are any specific concerns, I'd like to address them directly. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd allow the center to continue its work without further disruption." Wilkes chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Relax, Doc. You've got nothing to hide, right?" The words stung, their condescension cutting deeper than the officers likely realized. Evan met Wilkes's gaze, his voice steady but pointed. "That's not the issue here, officer. The issue is the assumption that I might have something to hide." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Evan's words hanging heavy in the air. Carolyn glanced nervously between the men, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Daniels finally broke the silence, his tone cold. "We'll be on our way, then. But don't be surprised if we have more questions down the line." Evan stepped aside as the officers walked past, his calm demeanor masking the anger simmering beneath the surface. As the door closed behind them, Carolyn let out a shaky breath. "Dr. Cole, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice filled with regret. Evan shook his head. "You don't need to apologize for their behavior. Are the kids okay?" "They don't know what's going on," she assured him. "But the staff, we're all on edge." Evan nodded, his mind already racing. "Let me know if they come back or ask more questions, I'll handle it." The encounter stayed with Evan as he drove to the hospital. He replayed the conversation in his mind, dissecting every word, every subtle inflection. It wasn't the first time he'd dealt with situations like this, but it never got easier. He thought of his patients, people who trusted him to fix what was broken, to give them a chance at life. He thought of his mother, who had always believed in the power of humility and hard work to overcome prejudice. And he thought of Daniels, whose tone and actions had been anything but subtle. Evan parked in his reserved spot at the hospital, taking a moment to steady himself. There was work to be done. Lives to save. Whatever Daniels and Wilkes were playing at, it would have to wait. That evening, Evan returned home to find a folded note tucked under his front door. It wasn't uncommon for neighbors to leave messages or flyers, but something about this one felt off. The paper was plain, the handwriting scrawled and uneven. "Watch yourself. Some people don't belong here." Evan stared at the words, a chill running down his spine. He scanned the street, but it was quiet, the golden glow of porch lights dotting the neighborhood. The note wasn't just a message, it was a warning. Evan took a deep breath, folding the paper and slipping it into his pocket. He'd dealt with threats before, subtle and overt, but this one hit closer to home. Whoever had left it knew where he lived, knew enough to make their presence felt without revealing themselves. As he locked the door behind him, Evan resolved to confront the growing tension head-on. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the community, about the kids at the youth center, about the promises he'd made to himself and his mother. He wouldn't back down. The wind howled through the streets of Millbrook, carrying with it the weight of a brewing storm. Evan Cole tightened his coat around him as he stood on the steps of the youth center, his eyes scanning the parking lot. The note he'd found on his door had been a subtle yet unmistakable threat. And while he had no proof of who had left it, he couldn't shake the thought that Officer Daniels wasn't far removed from the message. Inside, the kids were finishing their after-school programs. Their laughter and energy echoed faintly through the halls, a sharp contrast to the unease Evan felt Carolyn had called earlier, reporting that Daniels had returned, this time asking to see the center's financial records. Though he'd left empty-handed, the implications were clear. This was no longer just about baseless suspicions. It was personal. Evan checked his watch. It was nearly closing time, and the staff was busy tidying up for the night. Just as he was about to head inside, a patrol car turned into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the dim light. Daniel stepped out, his expression cold and determined. He was alone this time, his presence a deliberate choice to intimidate. "Dr. Cole," Daniels greeted, his voice tight. "Officer Daniels," Evan replied, forcing calm into his tone. "Back again?" Daniels nodded, his eyes scanning the building behind Evan. "I'd like to ask you a few questions." Evan crossed his arms. "You've already been here today. If you have legitimate concerns, I suggest filing a formal inquiry with the board." Daniels stepped closer, his presence looming. "Funny how defensive you get when someone starts looking too closely at your operations." Evan's patience was wearing thin. "And I find it curious how often you show up unannounced, without cause. If there's something you need to discuss, I suggest we do it properly, not in parking lots under the guise of routine questioning." Daniels smirked, though there was no humor in it. "You think you're untouchable, don't you, big-shot surgeon, town philanthropist, but everyone's got something to hide." Evan felt the words like a slap, but he didn't flinch. "I have nothing to hide, officer. And your baseless insinuations won't change that." The tension crackled like electricity between them, neither man willing to back down. The following morning, Evan's worst fears materialized. As he pulled into the hospital parking lot, his phone buzzed relentlessly, with messages, news of his name being mentioned in connection with a supposed financial irregularity at the youth center was spreading like wildfire. Local gossip blogs had picked up the story, and though no formal accusations had been made, the damage was already taking root. Evan's chest tightened as he scrolled through the headlines. "Local doctor, under scrutiny, for youth center funds." Questions arise about philanthropist's true intentions. He was still staring at the screen when his assistant Mitchell appeared at the car window, looking pale. Dr. Cole, we have a problem, Mitchell said, his voice low. There's a reporter waiting in the lobby asking about the allegations. The board is concerned. Evan forced himself to nod, his mind already racing. Set up a meeting with the board, I'll address this head on. The meeting room at the hospital was stark and sterile, its usual quiet replaced with a palpable tension. The board members sat in a semicircle, their expressions ranging from skeptical to sympathetic. At the head of the table sat Chairman Robert Hastings, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor. Dr. Cole, Hastings began, his tone neutral but firm. I assume you've seen the report circulating this morning. Evan nodded. I have, and I want to make it clear that these allegations are baseless. There's no evidence to support any wrongdoing on my part or by the youth center. Hastings leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. Be that as it may, the optics are concerning. This hospital's reputation is closely tied to yours, and we can't afford to be dragged into a scandal. Evan's jaw tightened. I understand the concern, but this isn't a scandal. It's a targeted attempt to discredit me. I've been transparent in every aspect of my involvement with the youth center, and I'm more than willing to provide any documentation you need to prove that. A murmur rippled through the room as Hastings exchanged a glance with the other members. Transparency is appreciated, Dr. Cole, Hastings said after a pause. But until this matter is resolved, we'll need to limit your public engagements on behalf of the hospital. It's a precaution to protect all parties involved. Evan opened his mouth to argue, but stopped himself. He could see the fear in their eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of association, of fallout. It stung, but he nodded curtly. Understood. As the meeting adjourned, Mitchell lingered behind, his brow furrowed. This is Daniels, isn't it? He asked, his voice low. Evan sighed, running a hand over his face. I can't prove it, but yes, he's made it clear he wants to discredit me, and this is just the beginning. Mitchell hesitated, then said, There's a council meeting tomorrow night. I heard Daniels will be there. Maybe it's time you confronted him, publicly. Evan considered the suggestion, the weight of it settling over him. It might come to that. That evening, Evan sat alone in his living room, the shadows of the past few days pressing heavily on him. He had always believed in fighting injustice through quiet perseverance. But this was different. Daniels wasn't just a man with a vendetta. He was a symbol of the systemic biases Evan had fought against his entire life. The note on his door, the repeated harassment, the smear campaign, each was a piece of a larger puzzle, one that threatened not just his reputation, but the work he'd built in Millbrook. Evan closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He thought of his mother, of her unwavering belief in standing tall, even when the world tried to cut you down. Tomorrow, he decided, would be the day he stopped waiting for the storm to pass. It was time to face it head on. The council meeting was packed, the small chamber filled with residents eager to discuss the latest controversies gripping the town. Evan entered quietly, his presence drawing murmurs and glances. He spotted Daniels near the front, flanked by a few familiar faces who shared his disdainful gaze. As the meeting began, topics ranged from zoning issues to school funding, the usual fare for Millbrook politics. But when the floor opened to public concerns, Daniels was the first to stand. I'd like to address an issue that's been on the minds of many residents, he began, his voice carrying a practiced authority. The integrity of individuals who claim to serve this community. His words were calculated, his gaze flicking briefly to Evan before returning to the council members. We have a responsibility to ensure that no one is above scrutiny, regardless of their title or influence. Evan's chest tightened, but he kept his face impassive. As Daniels continued his thinly veiled attack, Evan's resolve hardened. When Daniels finally sat, the room buzzed with murmurs. Evan stood, his movements deliberate as he approached the microphone. The chatter died as he began to speak. My name is Dr. Evan Cole, he said, his voice steady. Many of you know me as a surgeon, a supporter of this community, and someone who has worked tirelessly to make Millbrook a better place. But tonight, I'm standing here as a man who refuses to be silenced by baseless accusations and systemic bias. The room fell silent, all eyes on Evan as he continued. For the past few weeks, I've been the target of harassment and unfounded scrutiny. My contributions to the youth center have been questioned without cause, My character has been smeared without evidence. And I believe it's time we address the real issue here. Not what I've done, but why certain individuals feel the need to undermine me. Evan's gaze locked with Daniel's, unflinching. This isn't just about me. It's about the message we send to anyone who dares to challenge the status quo, who dares to stand out in a town that prides itself on being close-knit, yet struggles to embrace diversity. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken truths. Evan took a deep breath, his voice softening, but losing none of its power. I'm not here to ask for validation or approval. I'm here to remind you that integrity isn't defined by appearances or assumptions. It's defined by actions, by standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. As he stepped back, the room erupted in a mix of applause and hushed conversations. Daniels's face was unreadable, but Evan could feel the shift in the room. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was beginning to turn. The quiet buzz of a normal day at the hospital was shattered when Evan's phone vibrated relentlessly on his desk. He hesitated before glancing at it, already dreading what awaited him. The screen was filled with notifications, articles, comments, and messages that carried the same damning headline. Prominent surgeon under investigation for financial mismanagement at youth center. Evan stared at the screen, the words blurring as his pulse quickened. A part of him knew this was coming, that Daniels wasn't done, but seeing it unfold in real time felt like a punch to the gut. Mitchell appeared at the door, his face pale. Evan, have you seen this? I've seen it, Evan replied, his voice tight. Mitchell hesitated. The hospital board called an emergency meeting for tomorrow. They're talking about putting you on temporary leave until this is resolved. Evan looked up sharply. Temporary leave, based on unfounded rumors? Mitchell raised his hands, placating. I know it's unfair, but they're scared. Evan, the board doesn't want the hospital's reputation tied to a potential scandal. Evan's jaw tightened, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his chest. He could feel the walls closing in, the system once again forcing him to defend himself against baseless accusations. Later that afternoon, Evan sat in his office, the blinds drawn to block out the prying eyes of reporters camped outside the hospital. His inbox was flooded with questions and requests for comments, each one demanding a piece of him. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. It was Mitchell again, but this time, his expression carried a mix of urgency and unease. You're not going to like this, Mitchell began, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Just say it, Evan said, bracing himself. Daniels is holding a press conference tonight, Mitchell said. Word is, he's going to double down on these allegations, something about new evidence tying you to financial discrepancies at the youth center. Evan's stomach dropped. What evidence? There's nothing to find because there's nothing there. Mitchell sighed. You know that I know that, but Daniels is playing a different game. He doesn't need proof, just the appearance of it. Evan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Daniels wasn't just trying to ruin him, he was trying to destroy everything Evan stood for. What are you going to do? Mitchell asked after a long silence. Evan sat up, his resolve hardening. I'm going to that press conference. Mitchell blinked in surprise. Evan, that's risky. If Daniels has the crowd on his side. I don't care, Evan interrupted, his voice firm. I'm not letting him control the narrative. This stops tonight. By the time evening fell, the tension in Millbrook was palpable. The press conference was being held in the town square, the same place where Evan had confronted Daniels at the council meeting. But tonight, the crowd was larger, more restless. Evan arrived with Mitchell by his side. Reporters turned their cameras toward him the moment he stepped out of his car, their questions coming in rapid fire. Dr. Cole, do you have a response to the allegations? Are you guilty of financial misconduct? Do you plan to step down from your position at the hospital? Evan ignored them, his focus locked on the podium where Daniels stood, flanked by a few officers and town officials. The sight of Daniels' smug expression sent a wave of anger coursing through Evan, but he forced himself to stay calm. As Daniels began to speak, his words were laced with insinuation and carefully crafted accusations. We've uncovered concerning patterns in the financial records of the youth center, Daniels said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. While we cannot make definitive statements at this time, we believe it is our duty to investigate further. Evan could feel the eyes of the crowd shifting toward him, their judgment heavy in the air. Daniels continued, his tone taking on a self-righteous edge. No one is above the law, and we must ensure that those who claim to serve our community are held accountable. The moment Daniels finished speaking, Evan stepped forward, his movements deliberate. The crowd parted as he approached the podium, murmurs growing louder. "Dr. Cole," one of the reporters called out, "do you have a statement?" Evan's gaze never wavered from Daniels as he took the microphone. "I do," Evan said, his voice steady but firm. "What you're witnessing tonight isn't an investigation. It's a calculated attempt to discredit me." The crowd fell silent, their attention now fully on Evan. "For weeks, I've been the target of harassment and baseless accusations," he continued. "And while I would like to believe this is the result of a misunderstanding, the truth is much darker. This isn't about justice, it's about prejudice." Daniels bristled, his smug expression replaced with one of irritation. "Dr. Cole," Daniels interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension, "we're simply following where the evidence leads." Evan turned to face him, his composure unshaken. "Evidence? You have yet to produce evidence that doesn't exist because the youth center's finances are transparent. This is about something else entirely, isn't it, Officer Daniels?" The crowd murmured, their curiosity piqued. Daniels' face reddened, but he managed to maintain his composure. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Dr. Cole." "I'm implying," Evan said, his voice growing stronger, "that this is about undermining someone who doesn't fit into your narrow view of this community. It's about power and control, not truth." The tension in the air was thick, the crowd hanging on every word. "Do your job, Officer Daniels," Evan continued, his voice cutting through the silence, "but do it with integrity, because the people of Millbrook deserve better than this." As Evan stepped back, the crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and questions. Daniels stood frozen, his expression a mask of frustration and barely concealed rage. Evan turned to leave, his heart pounding. The battle wasn't over, but he had made his stand. The next move was Daniels, and Evan knew it would be the most dangerous one yet. The cold night air stung Evan's face as he stood outside the youth center. His breaths came shallow and sharp, his mind racing as he replayed the press conference in his head. Daniels had been rattled, but not defeated, and Evan knew the officer wouldn't let the public confrontation go unanswered. He didn't have to wait long. A squad car pulled into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the dark. Daniels stepped out, his face shadowed under the brim of his hat. Behind him, Officer Wilkes emerged, his expression smug as ever. Evan stood his ground, his hands steady at his sides despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Dr. Cole," Daniels called, his voice echoing in the stillness. "We need to have a word." "Do we?" Evan replied, his tone calm but firm. "Because I believe we said everything that needed to be said earlier tonight." Daniels chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You think you can humiliate me in front of the whole town and walk away? That's not how this works." Evan stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "This isn't about you, Daniels. It's about justice. And your complete lack of it." Daniels' jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Watch your tone, Doc. You're already in enough trouble." "Am I?" Evan asked, tilting his head. "Because as far as I can tell, the only evidence you have is whatever you've fabricated to fit your narrative, and that's not going to hold up under scrutiny." Wilkes shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Daniels as if seeking reassurance. Daniels, however, remained steadfast, his expression hardening. "You're making a big mistake, Cole," Daniels said, his voice low and dangerous. "People like you don't get to come into towns like this and throw your weight around. You don't belong here." There it was, the mask slipping. The real reason for Daniels' relentless pursuit, laid bare in a single moment of unguarded prejudice. Evan stared at him, the weight of the officer's words settling over him like a heavy shroud. But instead of backing down, he drew himself up, his voice steady and resolute. "You don't get to decide where I belong," Evan said, his tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "And you certainly don't get to weaponize your badge to enforce your biases." Daniels stepped closer, his face mere inches from Evan's. "You think you're better than me, with your fancy degrees and your charity cases? You don't know the first thing about this town." "I know enough," Evan replied, holding his ground. I know that people like you thrive on fear and division, but I'm not afraid of you, Daniels, and I won't let you tear down what I've built here. Wilkes took a step forward, his hand hovering near his holster. You might want to be careful, Dr. Cole. Threatening an officer is a serious offense. Evan's eyes flicked to Wilkes, his voice calm but pointed. The only threats being made tonight are by the men who are supposed to protect this community. Before the situation could escalate further, a car pulled into the lot, its engine cutting off abruptly. The door opened, and Mitchell stepped out, his phone in hand. Evan, Mitchell called, his voice tense but steady. Is everything okay? Evan glanced at him, a flicker of relief crossing his face. It's fine. Mitchell officers Daniels and Wilkes were just leaving. Mitchell nodded, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the two officers. I hope that's true, because I've been recording since I pulled in, and I'd hate for anything you say to be taken out of context, officers. Daniels' face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. You think this is over? He spat, his voice low. It is for tonight, Evan said, his voice unwavering. Unless you'd like to explain to the entire town why you're harassing me without cause. For a moment, it seemed like Daniels might lash out, but then he stepped back, his expression twisted with rage. Let's go, Wilkes, Daniels muttered, turning toward the squad car. Wilkes hesitated, his eyes darting between Daniels and Evan, before finally following his superior. The car's tires screeched as they sped out of the lot, leaving Evan and Mitchell standing in the cold silence. Inside the youth center, Evan sank into a chair, his hands trembling. Despite his outward calm, Mitchell sat across from him, his expression a mix of concern and admiration. Are you okay? Mitchell asked after a long silence. Evan nodded, though his voice was strained. I'm fine, but this isn't over. Mitchell leaned forward, his tone serious. Evan, Daniels is dangerous. He's not going to stop until he feels like he's won. I know, Evan said, his voice quiet but firm. But I'm not going to stop either. I've worked too hard, given too much to let him tear it all down. Mitchell hesitated before pulling out his phone. I've been digging into Daniel's record. He's got a history of questionable conduct, complaints that were swept under the rug, incidents that never made it to the public. Evan looked at him, his brow furrowing. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I wanted to make sure I had enough to connect the dots, Mitchell explained. And now I do. There's a pattern, Evan. He's targeted others before, people he thought he could intimidate, but you're the first person who's fought back this hard. Evan's mind raced as he processed Mitchell's words. This wasn't just about him. Daniel's behavior was part of a larger problem, one that had likely harmed countless others. What do you want to do? Mitchell asked, his voice steady. Evan took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. We expose him, everything he's done, every person he's hurt. We bring it all to light. Mitchell nodded, a flicker of determination crossing his face. I'll gather everything I have, we'll make sure everyone knows the truth. Evan stood, his shoulders squaring as he looked toward the door. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he had the upper hand. As they left the youth center, the night air felt a little less heavy, but Evan knew the battle ahead would be the hardest yet. Daniels wouldn't go down without a fight, and the stakes were higher than ever. But Evan was ready. For the town, for the youth center, for every person who had ever been silenced by the system. The truth would come out, and Evan would make sure of it. The council chambers were packed to capacity, the air thick with tension as townsfolk murmured in hushed voices. Evan Cole stood at the back of the room, his posture tense but composed. Tonight, the council was voting on whether to temporarily suspend the youth center's operations pending a full audit, another ploy masterminded by Daniels to dismantle Evan's work under the guise of transparency. Daniels was seated near the front, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as he exchanged whispers with Wilkes. To anyone else, he might appear calm, almost detached, but Evan recognized the calculated confidence of a man who believed he had already won. The meeting began with the usual formalities, roll call, approval of minutes, but it wasn't long before the room's attention shifted to the main event. Next on the agenda, announced the council chair, her voice steady but strained, is a motion to suspend operations at the Millbrook Youth Center, pending an independent audit of its financial practices. A murmur rippled through the room. Carolyn Marks, seated a few rows ahead of Evan, turned to glance at him, her face etched with worry. He gave her a reassuring nod, though his heart pounded in his chest. Daniels rose from his seat, adjusting his tie as he approached the podium. His every movement was deliberate, designed to project authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone oozing feigned concern, "we're here tonight not to point fingers, but to ensure the integrity of a beloved institution. Recent discoveries suggest discrepancies in the youth center's financial records, discrepancies that demand our attention." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, the implication heavy. "As public servants, it is our duty to act in the best interest of this community. I urge the council to approve this motion so that we can uncover the truth." Evan felt his blood boil as Daniels stepped back, his smug expression daring anyone to challenge him. But before the chair could call for a vote, Evan stood, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Madam Chair, may I address the council?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Evan. The chair hesitated before nodding. "You may, Dr. Cole." Evan strode to the podium, his movements measured but purposeful. As he stood before the council, he scanned the room, meeting the eyes of those gathered. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I stand before you not as a surgeon or a benefactor, but as a member of this community. A community I care deeply about." He paused, letting his words settle. "The allegations brought against the youth center, and by extension myself, are baseless. The center's financial records are transparent, its operations above board. But this isn't about finances, this is about power." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, but Evan pressed on. "For weeks, I've been the target of harassment and intimidation by individuals who are more interested in maintaining control than serving justice. Tonight's motion is just another attempt to undermine not only me, but the very fabric of what makes this community strong, its resilience, its diversity, its willingness to stand together." Daniel shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "With all due respect, Dr. Cole, this isn't about you. This is about accountability." Evan turned to face him, his expression unyielding. "Accountability. Coming from a man who has used his position to bully and intimidate. Tell me, Officer Daniels, when was the last time you investigated a matter without bias clouding your judgment?" The room gasped, the tension palpable. Daniels took a step forward, his composure slipping. "Watch yourself, Cole." "No," Evan said, his voice rising. "It's time you watched yourself. Because I've spent the past 2 days gathering evidence of my own complaints reports, incidents swept under the rug. It paints a damning picture of a man who has abused his authority, time and time again." Daniel's face darkened, but he said nothing. Evan turned back to the council, his voice steady once more. "I have submitted this evidence to the council clerk," he said, gesturing toward a folder in the clerk's hands. "It outlines a pattern of misconduct that should give every one of you pause before considering any motion Daniel supports." The chair signaled for the clerk to distribute the documents, and as the council members began to read, a heavy silence fell over the room. Daniels, now visibly agitated, pointed a finger at Evan. "This is a distraction, a desperate attempt to deflect from your own guilt." Evan stepped closer, his voice low but powerful. "You know the truth, Daniels, and so does everyone else in this room now." The council chamber erupted into chaos as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Daniels' protests grew louder, but the weight of the evidence against him was undeniable. Wilkes, who had stood by Daniel's side all evening, quietly slipped out of the room, his loyalty evaporating under the harsh glare of scrutiny. The chair called for order, her gavel striking the desk repeatedly. "Enough," she shouted, silencing the room. "We will take time to review these documents and reconvene at a later date. Until then, no action will be taken regarding the youth center." A wave of relief swept through the room, but it was tempered by the realization that this was only a temporary reprieve. As Evan stepped away from the podium, Carolyn approached him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You did it," she whispered. "Not yet," Evan replied, his gaze fixed on Daniels, who stood frozen in the corner, his career unraveling before him. Outside the chamber, Evan leaned against a lamppost, the night air cool against his skin. Mitchell joined him, a faint smile on his face. "You were incredible in there," Mitchell said. Evan shook his head. This isn't over. Daniels won't go down quietly. Mitchell nodded. Maybe not. But you've shown this town who he really is. That's a victory. Evan glanced back at the chamber, where reporters were still milling about. It was a small victory, but the fight was far from over. Daniels would retaliate. Of that, Evan was certain. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The fallout from the council meeting was swift and far-reaching. The next morning, Millbrook's local paper ran a front-page article detailing the evidence Evan had presented, a damning compilation of complaints and suppressed investigations that painted Officer Daniels as a man unfit for his position. The story quickly spread, picked up by regional outlets, turning the spotlight on the small town and its flawed system. Daniels didn't show up for work that day. Rumors swirled that he'd been placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. His squad car was absent from the usual places, and the patrol officers who remained avoided discussing him altogether. Evan sat in his office at the hospital, staring at the morning's news coverage on his tablet. Mitchell sat across from him, his usual air of professionalism softened by a rare grin. "You did it," Mitchell said, his voice carrying an air of triumph. Evan shook his head, his gaze still on the screen. "We started something, that's all." Mitchell leaned forward. "You exposed him, Evan. You've given this town a chance to see the truth. That's no small thing." Evan finally looked up, his expression thoughtful. "It's a start. But Daniels was just one piece of a much larger system. There's more work to be done." The youth center resumed normal operations within days of the council meeting, bolstered by an outpouring of support from the community. Donations flooded in, many accompanied by handwritten notes expressing solidarity and gratitude. Carolyn could hardly keep up with the messages, her eyes often misting as she read them aloud to the staff. Evan made his first visit back to the center the following week. As he stepped through the doors, the sound of children laughing and playing filled his heart with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in weeks. Carolyn greeted him with a warm smile, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Dr. Cole," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We couldn't have done this without you." Evan shook his head. "This was a team effort, Carolyn. And it's far from over, but I'm glad the center is back where it belongs, in the hands of the community." As they spoke, a young boy ran up, holding a handmade card scrawled with colorful markers. He handed it to Evan, his eyes wide with admiration. "Thank you for saving the center," the boy said shyly, before darting back to his friends. Evan unfolded the card, his heart swelling as he read the simple message inside. "You're our hero." The investigation into Daniels gained momentum as more people came forward with stories of harassment and misconduct. A whistleblower from within the department leaked emails and reports that further implicated Daniels and his closest allies, including Wilkes. The evidence was irrefutable, leaving the town's leadership with no choice but to suspend Daniels indefinitely and open an internal review of the police force. At the same time, a grassroots movement began to take shape. Residents organized town hall meetings, demanding greater transparency and accountability from local officials. What had started as a battle between Evan and Daniels had grown into a community-wide reckoning, fueled by the courage of those who refused to remain silent. Evan attended one of these meetings, sitting quietly in the back as others shared their experiences and called for change. Though he hadn't intended to speak, he found himself standing when the floor opened for comments. "I never wanted to be at the center of this," he admitted, his voice steady but reflective. "But I'm grateful for the chance to be part of something bigger than myself. This isn't just about one man's actions, it's about creating a system that serves everyone fairly and justly. That's what I'm committed to, and I hope all of you will continue this fight with me." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in weeks, Evan felt a flicker of hope. Daniels's downfall came quietly. After weeks of public scrutiny and mounting evidence, he resigned from his position, citing personal reasons. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public apology, just a single hollow statement released to the press. For Evan, the resignation was bittersweet. Daniels was gone, but the scars of his actions remained. Trust would take time to rebuild, and the road ahead was far from easy. One evening, as Evan was locking up his office, he found Carolyn waiting for him in the hallway. She held a folder in her hands, her expression serious but hopeful. "What's this?" Evan asked, taking the folder from her. "It's a proposal," Carolyn said, "for a scholarship fund in your name, something to help the kids at the center pursue their dreams, whatever they may be." Evan opened the folder, scanning the carefully crafted plan inside. His throat tightened as he read the opening paragraph. The Dr. Evan Cole Scholarship Fund, dedicated to fostering resilience, courage, and opportunity in the next generation. "You don't have to do this," Evan said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "No," Carolyn replied, her smile gentle. "But we want to. You've done so much for this community, Evan. Let us do this for you." Evan nodded, unable to find the words to express his gratitude. As the weeks turned into months, life in Millbrook began to settle into a new rhythm. The youth center flourished, the hospital thrived under Evan's leadership, and the community continued its push for systemic change. Evan found solace in the small victories: each child who smiled at the center, each patient who thanked him for his care, each neighbor who stopped him on the street to express their support. He had changed, too. The ordeal had tested him in ways he never could have imagined, forcing him to confront not only external challenges, but his own resilience and determination. He had emerged stronger, more certain of his purpose, and more committed than ever to fighting for justice. One crisp autumn morning, Evan stood on the steps of the youth center, watching as children ran to greet their parents. Carolyn stood beside him, her hands in her pockets, as she surveyed the scene with quiet satisfaction. "We did good, didn't we?" she asked. Evan smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We did. But there's always more to do." Carolyn nodded. "And you'll be right there, leading the charge." Evan didn't respond, but his smile deepened. The battle against Daniels had been hard fought, but it was only the beginning. Millbrook had changed, and so had he. Together, they would keep pushing forward, step by step, until justice was more than just an ideal. It was a reality. The morning air carried a crispness that hinted at change. Evan Cole stood on the porch of the youth center, watching the sun rise over Millbrook. It painted the town in warm hues, casting shadows that seemed less ominous now than they had weeks before. The ordeal with Daniels had shaken Evan to his core, but as he stood there, watching the town stir to life, he realized something important. The shadows had always been there. What had changed was his willingness to confront them. For Evan, the journey had been one of resilience, reflection, and transformation. He had moved to Millbrook with the hope of fulfilling his mother's dream, of creating a space where he could make a difference. But he had also underestimated the challenges that would come with being a visible figure in a town still grappling with the weight of its prejudices. A personal transformation. Evan had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure, a trait honed through years of working in high-stakes medical environments. But the confrontation with Daniels had tested him in ways that no surgery ever could. It had forced him to confront not just external injustice, but his own vulnerability, his anger, and his determination to stand firm in the face of adversity. There were moments when he had doubted himself, when Daniels's accusations had felt too heavy to bear, when the town's whispers had become deafening. But through it all, he had leaned on his values, his allies, and the unwavering belief that truth and justice would prevail. The experience had hardened his resolve, making him not just a better advocate for his community, but a more introspective and self-aware person. Evan had learned that strength didn't come from silence or stoicism. It came from action. It came from speaking out, even when your voice trembled, and from standing tall, even when the ground beneath you felt unsteady. A community awakens. Evan's battle with Daniels was never just about one man. It had been a microcosm of a larger fight, a struggle against systemic biases that had long gone unchecked in Millbrook. Daniels had been a symptom, not the disease, and his exposure had forced the town to take a hard look at itself. The fallout had been messy, as change often is. Daniels' resignation had left a vacuum in the police force, but it had also created an opportunity for reform. The council had convened a special task force to review the department's practices, and residents were now more engaged in local governance than ever before. At town hall meetings, people shared stories of their own encounters with bias and abuse, stories that had once been whispered behind closed doors, but were now spoken aloud with courage and conviction. The youth center became a hub for activism, hosting workshops and discussions on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Evan watched these changes unfold with a mixture of pride and hope. The fight wasn't over, but the spark had been lit. Millbrook was waking up. The broader implications. What had happened in Millbrook was a reflection of a much larger issue. Daniels wasn't an anomaly. He was part of a system that too often valued power over accountability, perception over truth. Evan's story was one of countless others. Stories of individuals who had been silenced, marginalized, or dismissed simply for daring to exist outside the narrow confines of societal expectations. The events in Millbrook served as a reminder that systemic problems require systemic solutions. It wasn't enough to remove one corrupt officer or implement one policy change. Real progress required a cultural shift, a commitment to empathy, fairness, and justice at every level. For Evan, this realization was both sobering and empowering. It was easy to feel small in the face of such entrenched issues, but his experience had shown him that even small actions could ripple outward. One confrontation, one act of courage, could inspire others to stand up, to speak out, to demand better. Moving forward. Evan's life after the confrontation was both different and the same. He continued his work at the hospital, performing life-saving surgeries and mentoring young doctors. But he also became more deeply involved in the community, using his platform to advocate for change. The scholarship fund Carolyn had proposed became a reality, offering financial support to young people pursuing higher education. Evan took a personal interest in each recipient, meeting with them to hear their stories and encourage their dreams. The youth center flourished, its walls adorned with new murals painted by the children who had found safety and inspiration within its doors. Evan often visited, not as a benefactor, but as a member of the community. He would sit with the kids, sharing stories of his own struggles and triumphs, reminding them that they, too, had the power to overcome. Evan's relationship with the town remained complex. There were still those who viewed him with suspicion, who clung to old biases and resisted change, but there were also those who had come to see him not as an outsider, but as a catalyst for something better. A message of hope. Evan often reflected on the words his mother had instilled in him as a child. Change is slow, but it's worth fighting for. Those words had carried him through the darkest moments of his journey, reminding him that progress was rarely linear, but always possible. He hoped his story would inspire others to fight their own battles, to confront injustice wherever it appeared. Because if there was one thing he had learned, it was this: change starts with one voice, but it takes a chorus to sustain it. The road ahead. As Evan locked the doors of the youth center one evening, the sound of children's laughter still echoing in his ears, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The road ahead would be long, and the challenges would be many, but he was ready. The shadows in Millbrook hadn't disappeared, but they were no longer the dominant force. And for the first time, Evan felt certain that the light would continue to grow.